speaker, George MacKerron, who will be speaking on Back to Edgeworth, Estimating the Value of Time Using Hedonic Experiences. So we haven't talked about this before, but Back to Edgeworth is a reference maybe to another paper, Back to Bentham.
Could be.
Okay. Oh, maybe not.
I think it is. Chris is like, is it a reference, Chris? So, yeah, that's good.
And Edgeworth was the academic grandchild of Bentham, but a lot less progressive, as I recall.
I think Edgeworth was a weird character.
He was a bit of a weird character, yeah.
Regretting some way, probably.
He has some interesting ideas about measuring momentary well-being, which is the inspiration for some of this. So this is a paper with Chris. It's a sort of vaguely methodological paper, quite a simple paper. We run a couple of regressions, we divide a couple of coefficients, but we think there are some sort of interesting aspects to that. I hope these are the right slides. They don't look exactly like I expected, so if I argue with them, then it might be because they're an earlier version. So time really matters, right? Time matters as a sort of fundamental constraint, and time use in particular matters a lot to individuals. So time use seems like an important mediator in things like the relationship between income and life satisfaction. Richer people allocate their time slightly differently. And unsurprisingly, how happy people feel from moment to moment depends a lot on what they're doing. For example, me and Alex have a paper about how people don't enjoy being at work very much on average. Ultimately, we can't do much to increase the total amount of time we have in our lives, and there's this concept of time poverty in this area. But of course, we can look at opportunity costs, and we can potentially reallocate time by, for example, paying people to do basic tasks for us. And there's a sort of research agenda there, Ashley Willans and others, that looks at that. And maybe we don't often consider as opportunity costs, and we do have opportunities, in fact, to spend more time doing what we enjoy if we're willing to pay other people to do the things we enjoy less. What's the policy interest in this? One clear policy interest is that if markets are not providing ways for us to allocate our time in the best way, then there's a rationale for policy to intervene. And the obvious place that this happens is around transport, building new roads, building faster rail links. There's been a long-running debate in this country around HS2, lots of which hinges on the value of time. So potentially, there's a big potential to improve well-being by making these time-saving investments. On average in this country, people spend around 115 hours every year in traffic jams. In the US, it's close. Huge amount of regional disparity, so London is much worse than most other places. But we really could, we could make a big difference here. But how should we value time? How should we value the related time savings, which are going to be key inputs into a CBA on whether or not that's a good idea? And of course, we already have answers to that, and we're going to give you a new answer, which we'll talk about in a moment. More generally, this idea of time has had some attention in economics. Becker has this classic paper where he says that we split our budget of time between labour and leisure, which means that leisure is valued optimally at the wage rate. Later, people have pointed out, actually, well, as we just said, working causes some disutility, so that perhaps leisure should be valued at more than the wage rate. And there's also work that says, okay, but people don't necessarily have this sort of perfect ability to switch between labour and leisure at will, and where does that take us? Most of the empirical studies look at reductions in search or travel or waiting time in commuting or travelling, and Chris tells me there aren't that many of those papers. We think perhaps there could be more. And in general, these papers that use an empirical approach to look at the value of time either take a stated preference approach, and there are CV studies and choice experiments where, are people willing to pay more for shorter journeys, for example, and there are revealed preference studies where we actually see if people put their money where their mouth is in those situations, essentially. For example, what length of time are people willing to queue to save money on petrol, buying cheaper petrol? Perhaps there are longer queues. How much will people pay in road tolls to reduce the length of a journey, and so on. There's even sort of natural field experiments in this area, particularly around kind of ride-sharing apps where, for example, Goldsmith and now manipulate bundles of waiting times and prices that they offer to Lyft users and use that to see what the value essentially of waiting time appears to be to those users. Now, there's a bit of a difference here in that the stated preference and the revealed preference studies often come up with quite different values. The stated preference studies typically find values that are less than 25% of the mean wage rate. RP studies tend to be much higher and report values in excess of 75%. Typically, people have regarded the revealed preference versions as sort of the gold standard for intangibles like this. partly, we suspect people of strategic behaviour and so on. But the revealed preference method assumes that people act rationally. It assumes that people have perfect foresight that can always make this optimal trade-off for themselves, maximising welfare and revealing their true valuation. And that's nice, but we also know that there are problems with that. It matters how we present choices. It might matter whether we present time as saved or wasted in terms of gains and losses. It might matter, for example, if we ask them about, or if we look at time decisions made in terms of saving time now or saving time later. I'm aware of this. If I book a journey long time ahead, I think I'm often much too blasé about saving money at the expense of time and comfort later on. If I'm booking a journey for today, I'm probably much less likely to do that. So there's potentially issues of present bias. In the second place, there's a sort of subjectivity in what actually constitutes search or travel or waiting time and defining that. There's a subjectivity in the perception of time, how long people feel time takes to pass, and a really strong importance of the context in which people spend time waiting. Like, waiting by myself for an unpleasant activity is going to be very different than waiting with friends for a pleasant activity, which it's possible I won't even consider really as waiting, but as an element of socialising. And back to one again, apparently. I don't think that happened originally in the slides. People make systematic prediction errors when they're forecasting the welfare consequence of choices. This is just a very general point that we can't always rely on people to make the best decisions for themselves because of, what Dan Gilbert and others say about utility misprediction. So the stated preference may not be perfect. The revealed preference also may not be perfect. And so we're sort of proposing an alternative method, which is related to the kind of well-being valuation that's been done before. But this is specifically an experiential well-being valuation based on experience sampling data. So we're going to value time and related time saving using this experience sampling data. That doesn't require people ex ante to predict the welfare consequences at their choices when they're making their choices. Instead, it looks at how they feel once they've made those choices. So in other words, it doesn't rely on individuals thinking correctly about what the welfare consequences of choices will be. It relies on how they actually feel when they're experiencing those choices. And experience sampling, it goes back in the 70s to the sort of psychology literature, but we would argue, in fact, it goes back much further than that, back to Edgeworth, as in the title here, who in 1881 argued that technical developments would make it possible to measure people's momentary utility on a physiological basis using what he called a hedonometer, a psychophysical machine continually registering the height of pleasure experienced by an individual exactly according to the verdict of consciousness, or rather diverging therefrom according to a law of errors. And so our method sort of builds on this idea of a hedonometer, but it has some important differences. We collect data at discrete moments rather than continuously. And critically, we don't have to assume that what we're measuring is actually utility. We only have to care that it's a thing that people care about and can trade off with income in the same way that they could trade their waiting time off with income. The data that we have comes from the Mappiness study, which ran from, it'll tell me in a moment, ran from 2010 to 2017. I really ought to know that. People gave us a sort of a happiness report on a little slider in an app here. They could download the app for free. We had about 30,000 people in the data that we're using here, give us just over 2 million responses. And because it was featured in the App Store and various places in the media, we have a reasonably broad participant base. I like to say this as, imagine you have an experiment, and now imagine it's really big. It's not a perfectly representative sample, but it is large and it is reasonably wide. We do have, it's gender balanced, we have a range of incomes, we have a range of ages, they're a little bit younger, they're a little bit wealthier, but it's a reasonably broad base. There are two survey modules in the app. Firstly, people give us some social demographic information when they sign up. They're not giving that when they're giving us the happiness responses, so we're not priming them to think about their income when they're thinking about how they feel. And then after that, people typically get 2 messages at random moments between 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. They can change those settings, much like getting a text message, and they spend 30 seconds responding. They got asked these questions. Do you feel happy? Take a slider from not at all to extremely. It's scaled from 0 to 10 in this paper. Doesn't have numbers for respondents. The slider starts in the middle. Possibly that's an error, and we may correct that in future. They asked who they're with, what kind of place they're in, and what they're doing. They're asked in this order, so happiness comes first, again, to try and avoid priming them. And then we try to estimate the value of time in waiting like this. We have happiness on the left of respondent I at time t, and we have a lot of things on the right. So we have a waiting dummy that's equal to 1 if people say that they're waiting or queuing. We have activity dummies for the other 41 activities that people can report doing. Companionship dummies for who they're with. Place dummies for whether they're indoors, outdoors, or in a vehicle, at home, at work, or somewhere else. and various kinds of weather controls, temperature, wind, rain, clouds, sunshine, daylight, and so on. We also have region fixed effects. We have reasonably small regions. These are mid-level super output areas. Time dummies for weekdays, holidays, months, years, and we also have individual fixed effects. And we have robust standard errors clustered at both region and respondent level with this reg HDFE command and stator. And in the rest of the presentation, we're going to simplify this down and put most of the survey data in this composite vector X and most of the time dummies in this composite vector T. But this is essentially the same thing, just with fewer letters. And what we're interested in this equation is delta, right? The coefficient on weighting, the coefficient that's associated with being engaged in the activity waiting or queuing, as opposed to not waiting or queuing, holding everything else in the equation constant. And we're also a little bit interested in terms of what this means in how much time people spend in waiting or queuing, which we can simply get from the summary statistics. How do we identify the effect here? We're exploiting the randomized timing of the experience sampling pings. Right, when the respondent message is random, and therefore it's completely unrelated to the outcome. It's also unrelated to the start and end of activities, or to any other activities that they're doing, or the context in which they do them. I won't go into this, but we are quite careful to make sure that even though you can't get two signals too close together, these occur at random moments. Some activities and contexts might be more likely to co-occur with waiting or queuing. You're much more likely to be waiting, for example, as implied in my introduction, when, for example, you're traveling. So it's important to control for these other things. The identifying assumption is that whether or not you're waiting or queuing is independent from how happy you were, moments before or at that time. And the reporting also is independent, conditional on these other activities and time and context that we're controlling for. Are these slides crucial, do you think, Chris?
I think it's selection on observables and relying on the little fixed effects and the controls. And then we basically, if we take them out, the coefficient doesn't change much. So we basically say that reasonably exceptional.
Yeah. So essentially, we have person fixed effects, which we hope take out most of the time invariant stuff, and then we have a reasonably wide range of controls, which we hope deal with most of the remaining stuff. And then, as Chris says, there might still be some residual selection, but the promising point is that it doesn't seem to matter very much what goes into the regression in terms of how big delta is. It changes delta a little bit. It doesn't change delta hugely, and there's a kind of Oster stability check that we will do that we haven't yet run. I haven't yet run. What do we find? We find that waiting or queuing has a really strong negative effect on happiness. Interestingly, in the way that we look at this, it's worse than the effect of working and studying. Delta is minus 0.36. The only things that it's better than are being ill in bed or caring or helping for adults. Immediately next, it's worse than traveling or commuting, working or studying, admin, and then down at the bottom here we have the very most happy activities. How much time do people spend waiting? In our sample, they spend about 2.3% of the time, so 2.3% of responses appear to be waiting. That compares, for example, to working, which people report doing about a quarter of the time. The value of time that we calculate then, which is the monetary value of spending 60 minutes waiting or queuing, as opposed to the sort of frequency-weighted average of all the other activities that people can be doing. So this sort of counterfactual is that we say people would reallocate that time in proportion to the amount of time that they usually spend on all those other activities. We would argue that it's a little bit more generalizable than other estimates in the literature because it should apply to all the kinds of waiting and queuing that people do, not only, say, waiting in traffic jams or on trains or for trains. And then we calculate the value of time both in waiting and queuing and then subsequently in every other activity sort of for comparison. So essentially, we have the marginal rate of substitution between the waiting and income, and we get this value. I'm not going to go through this completely wrecked equation, but we get the value of £12.20 essentially as our value of time in waiting and queuing. And that uses an income coefficient that we get from an additional regression where we don't include the fixed effect so that we can put in the time invariant income. The coefficient we get there actually is exceptionally similar to what Killingsworth gets in his time use papers, which is reassuring. And we use a median income for the UK adjusted to be expressed in terms of pounds per hour. And so on average, it seems the value of time in waiting and queuing is around £12.20 or $16.60. That's about 87% of the median wage rate in the UK. I think it's slightly unfair of us to use the 2021 figure because most of this data comes from a little bit earlier, but that won't change things hugely. It's smaller than what we see in the Goldsmith and Owl paper, but actually not so far off. So I think the findings from the wellbeing data look pretty similar to the observed behaviour, which is perhaps boring but reassuring. It's a little bit smaller than UK government values. UK government in CBA tends to use nearly £20 for an hour of leisure time commuting and nearly £40 for an hour of working time spent commuting. And then our final slide, which you can just about make out, I think, compares that with the value of time that we estimate using the same methodology for a variety of other activities, working, meeting, travelling, and so on. And I don't have a lot of discussion of this, but I would make the point that I'm working right now on a successor to Mappiness, which will hopefully be all over the world and have a wide variety of other questions. And I'd also be very interested to discuss anyone's thoughts on that later today or tomorrow as well. So in terms of discussion, thank you, and let's talk. Sure. Alex.
So who does the weighting then? 2.3% of most people's time. Is there a lot of variance in that across person type? You probably didn't look at that because you were really thinking within person.
We haven't looked at that in lots of detail. I suspect there is quite a lot of variance. For example, we've said that this is weighting in all kinds of areas, but I'm sure that travelling and commuting are a key element of that. So that commuters, if you look at the pictures that people take in Mappiness, for example, there are lots of train platforms there. And actually, one of the points that I didn't make on the identification slide that we skipped was that actually we probably slightly oversample the waiting time. So 2.3% potentially is a slight overestimate, just because when you're waiting is the time maybe when you get your phone out and say, oh, I've got a thing from Mappiness, and you respond.
The traffic jam when you are the driver.
That's true. That would underestimate it. Yeah, that's true. So we're probably slightly sort of oversampling public transport waiting and undersampling private transport waiting in that way. Yeah. No, it's an interesting question though. We should check that, shouldn't we? Who are the waiters?
Just curiosity of how the app works. Can people not answer to the notification? Can they just decide now I'm not going to answer this, or can you take into account how later they answer?
Yes, no, we can't administer progressively increasing electric shocks or anything. No, we can't force them. Typically, we use the responses where people have responded within an hour, and we regard those as sort of random enough, and we ignore ones that have gone beyond an hour, which is what we do here. In some earlier papers, we have sort of played with, what if we extend it to 3 hours? Or I think more normal in the ESM literature is that we take a much shorter period and say it's got to be 10 or 20 minutes. That reduces the sample size a lot, but it doesn't actually normally change the results. Sometimes things drop out of significance because now the sample size is much smaller, but it doesn't seem to make a large amount of difference. The nice thing is that you're supposed to answer for the moment that you answer and not for the moment that the ding went. So there should be no recall bias, even though there's a certain amount of selection bias. Chris. Oh.
I might have missed this, you might have mentioned it, but you don't see people, driving may be the exception, but if you're driving, you can still be talking on the phone, you can be listening to something audio. But when I see somebody waiting, queuing, it's very rare to see anybody who's just actually enjoying their own thoughts. So
sure.
So one comment is, I think something about in defense of, the blog, reference to a blog, in defense of boredom. Boredom is actually something we don't have enough of anymore, and it's where a lot of creativity comes from. If you watch children, only when they're bored do they actually are they're most creative. So I don't know much about that, but I'm thinking that most people are actually checking their email or social media or something when they are answering. Is that? Do you allow them to say more than one thing?
Yes, so you can answer multiple categories, and so that's kind of, this waiting, some of it will be exclusively waiting, but often they'll be waiting, listening to music, waiting and checking email, waiting and travelling, say. I mean, if you're kind of waiting for a train, you might well tick both of those. So that's taken out at the same time, and the idea is this is sort of the pure effect of waiting on top of those other things. I mean, you're right, and I think the interesting thing is that we know that all of these people have got iPhones and they're early adopters of iPhones, and so waiting for them is probably less immediately aversive because they've definitely got something else to do, even if, as you say, we're missing out on all kinds of creative ideas from them for that reason. But
so do you report the raw coefficient without controlling for the other activities as well?
We don't here, do we?
We don't.
No.
Because that would be interesting.
For all other activities.
Maybe they're just fine on balance?
Well, actually, if we do not, as George has said, if we do not control for anything, the result actually becomes pretty much stable. The delta is pretty stable. We find the delta is very stable, even if we look at different types of people, actually.
So actually, yeah, we do in the paper, we do build it up. In fact, we do build it up from just having weighting in, more or less, don't we?
Just
So
a good point. I mean, in terms of might be creative, and some people might have might not have this hedonic drag, but I think they might not classify this weighting in this case. So it's very subjective. If they consider weighting, they consider weighting. So.
But no, it's a good point. And my own kids, since lockdown, definitely spend too much time on screens and not enough time bored. And it's a hard sell, though, isn't it? It's really good for you to be bored, honestly. Did you have a question, sir?
Yeah, two questions, but maybe I missed it. But do you look at heterogeneous effect depending on income, for example, to have a like opportunity cost of time that is different depending on income? And the second question is, maybe I missed it as well, but I don't know how many years do you have, or how many the period of time, because can you look at whether, for instance, the negative effect of waiting has increased over time, or are we becoming more impatient somehow?
That's an interesting question. So we've got, I'll take the second one first. We have sort of middle of 2010 for about 7 years that we use here. But very much the largest amount of the data is sort of early on, sort of mid 2010 to 2012, and then we kind of have a tail. We could try comparing over time. I suspect that we might find that we don't get many significant effects just because there's so many more data points early on in the period and so many fewer later. In terms of income, I can't remember if that makes it to the final paper, but we did look at that, Chris, didn't we? And I think we found that doesn't make a big difference to how you feel in waiting. It obviously makes a difference to how you monetize the waiting, because you'd be willing to pay more to avoid it. But the experience doesn't seem to change much by income. The value probably does change. And this is the value at the median. But yeah, well, which is in itself, I think, we kind of found interesting.
I have another question. Sorry, you took my next question about income, but this session is called Wellbeing Policy and Interventions, which you did not choose, it chose you, but can you say anything about policy? You gave some CBA numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think very broadly, I think this kind of experiential method is an interesting additional way to look at the kinds of numbers that we can put into CBAs. And I wouldn't want to put all my eggs in that basket yet, but so far it looks moderately practical in terms of the results that we come up with. And Chris, you want to say more on that?
You did quantify that. So on average, you wait 20 minutes per day. You calculate actually wait in your lifetime about 1 year, which is the wage. And in terms of if you quantify it for a social welfare, we calculated the monetized rate and band this benefit to Londoners, because we had a London version, and it would be around 5% of London GDP in terms of the size. So it's really it's very substantial. But the question is, how much does it cost to reduce waiting time? Right? And it might be schedule optimization for free. Maybe we can train people some sort of skills that they, basically manage their time better, which might be for free, but bridges might be very expensive.
I came here using Crossrail. I know that cost a reasonable amount, didn't it?
You make a good point though about waiting being a heterogeneous state. So in George's data, you can see if you can get back to zero if you're waiting with friends with a coffee to see your favourite band. I don't think you've got a favourite band, is it? But you can do most else with your data, and we did that in the work stuff, and virtually nothing gets you back to a non.
No, that's right. I mean, we have interacted with some of the other activities, I think, as well, haven't we, Chris?
I'm curious to know whether you can get it up when it's a particular flavour of waiting.
I think we see almost every combination. So sort of negative effects that are made worse by waiting, negative effects that are made better by waiting, positive effects that are made. I don't think we see positive effects that are made better. Is the one that we don't see. Yeah. Being ill in bed, for example, is less bad if you're also waiting.
Commuting's really bad anyway.
Yeah.
So commuting and waiting for the train, that's a really bad thing. And I think that's policy relevant.
No, that's true.
Don't wait for trains in Japan.
No. So yeah, just that information on kind of how do these things add, right? Which ones are sort of super additive, which ones are sub additive? Yeah, what are the worst times and the best times to be rating? Sure.
Last question between us and food.
Yeah, no pressure. Can you trial of having a control group that would over a year run a meditation course over an app, and then control that with the other 1,000 people that haven't done it, and then see how they value their waiting time? To extend your research further?
Yeah, or I suppose, we could just teach people to meditate in the app. So actually I did previously have a kind of sideline in apps that teach people to meditate. We might well be able to repurpose some of that. Yeah, that would be kind of an interesting trial, wouldn't it? And you're right, that you might see the impact there in people waiting. I mean, the thing that we do see in this data is that people get happier over time. So just reflecting on their well-being, there's a question of how much it's the reporting that changes and how much it's the actual happiness that changes. But it does seem possible that, in fact, just thinking about this makes people more mindful of how they spend their time and helps them to allocate their time better. But yeah, that would be a kind of interesting intervention.
Could there be a nutrition factor there, where people start disengaging with it?
They could, and they only answer when they're kind of in a good mood. Yeah, that's the reporting point, and it's hard to disentangle that, but yeah.
Let's thank George and